You were saying about the numbers of folks in need of housing increasing and the need for housing. And when you talk about people with incomes of 26,000 or less, you're talking about people who are on Social Security and SSI. And a lot of those people are going to be elderly, and that population is going to increase. And that's just the way the demographics are. So we need to be thinking about, you know, more housing options for folks who are aging. And sometimes the current options are not always suitable for those folks. They don't have the type of accessibility and accommodations they might need. So in building that housing, which I agree is really the root of it, we have to plan for that demographic as well. So I just want to mention that. Thank you. Thank you.
And I'm going to actually pause as I'm moderating this group. I missed something really important. And I also have a request. If you could say your name, put your name into the room. And no, don't apologize because I forgot to ask. And also pronouns, preferred pronouns.
Hi, my name is Margaret. Thank you.
And then preferred pronouns, he, she, they.
She.
Thank you. All right. Then the other part that I actually forgot that's fairly important, I'm going to go through this really quickly, is I just want to make a couple agreements, and I'm inviting you, of course, this is open, and so if you have anything that's missing that you absolutely want to have up here, please let me know. So kind of a given in this conversation to remain open in a way that resounds for you, to remain open to hearing, receiving, understanding to the best of your ability. Lessons leave and stories stay. So if there are personal stories that are shared, they don't leave this room, but the lessons that you've obtained from those stories being shared do. Commit to presence and engagement, and that will be different for everyone. So if that means just trying to stay awake in this moment because you've had a long day and you still showed up, then that's it. But I invite you to commit to being here. Please use I statements, just framing it from a point of view that belongs to you as opposed to encompassing an entire group. Speak for yourself, and take care of yourself as well. So this is a topic in which harm is ever present, and harm can also happen in a discussion. Folks can be triggered emotionally, spiritually, physically. Well, it's all physical at some point. So if you feel the need to get some fresh air, move your body, stretch, whatever it is that you need, get something to drink, get something to eat, just take care of yourself within this conversation. And anything else that folks might like to see on this as an agreement that we can make with each other? Thank you. Yeah, so if you notice that you tend to be a little quiet sometimes, check in with yourself, and if you feel the burning need to speak and you're holding back, maybe step up to let that come into the room, because chances are that's something that folks need to hear, maybe something that someone else is thinking. Likewise, if you are usually at the forefront of the conversation, be present to that and check in with yourself and maybe notice when you need to hang back a little bit to allow another voice to come into the room. Did I get that correctly? Thank you. I hear it a lot of different ways, though. All right. Anyone else have something to add? Yeah. Oh, you want to comment on? Thank you. If we're good, we can add to this at any point. Thank you for your patience.
Do I have to say my name again? Okay. Well, Evelyn, she, her. Yeah. This is kind of something just to put out there for everybody, including other panelists. When I was doing work at SPU with Tent City 3, we talked a lot about low barrier versus high barrier housing and about how difficult I was participating in helping do research and take interviews and stuff for the professors I was working under at the time. And when interviewing people, it really came up that like, oh, my evictions or oh, my addictions, you know, stuff like that. The things that people take on personally as their own issues or their own things that make them unable to get housing in the first place. I guess my question just to everybody would be, how do we make it easier for people to see that there's healing available on the other side, if that makes sense. I feel like a lot of people get stuck in this space of like, I'm not even good enough to get into this housing. And so they keep themselves there and energetically they stay there and it perpetuates itself. And I'm not saying that super low barrier housing works better over high barrier either way, but I guess I'm just asking, what should we do about that component? Because that's been burning and on my mind for quite a bit lately.
Is the question, how do we consider no barrier, low barrier housing?
Yeah, how do we reach people in a way that's not something that scares them away from reaching out and getting the things that they need, if that makes sense.
Okay.
People who are scared to get things that are considered higher barrier housing, thinking more about like comorbidity when it comes to addiction or when it comes to
Right.
maybe having family members who might not also be able to come with or things like that.
How do we improve accessibility to those services? Yeah, thank you. Before I start writing, anyone else looking for?
Gloria, and I guess my question has always been, I guess the hot topic is housing, and I get that. I mean, I work with it every day, but why have we made it such a priority? Because there seems to be so many other issues involved that need to be corrected before the housing.
And just so you know, if you're not in the mic, the recording won't hear your voice.
I would say, I'm Asher, he, him. I would say that like food, water, shelter, those are the three most basic things we have to provide for people. So I wouldn't say at all that there are more important things than housing right now, you know?
Thank you.
My understanding of, I think what you're getting at, Zach, is like there are barriers that are like sort of going back to what we started with, making things more complicated than they need to be to get people those basic needs, and removing those, like the pieces that just overcomplicate things, just would make just make this run more smoothly. So for example, thank you for bringing up before seniors and planning for the aging population. That was I worked with Denise Malm, who was on this panel at the first event for my field practicum, and we did a research project with folks over 50 who had experienced any kind of housing instability. And one of the most prominent themes that came up was sort of a sense of like disempowerment, disenfranchisement from having representation or having like feeling like someone would listen, which is something that's kind of par for the course with ageism in this country and our culture in general, but also just also par for the course kind of in our politics. So that's just something that I have found is a piece. This isn't really proposing a solution, but I'm agreeing that like there are things that prevent people from reaching out that are cultural, and that people, for a lot of reasons that might not seem obvious a lot of the time, allow things to get to the point where they're out of hand and can't, we don't really address things at the beginning. We address things when they're unmanageable. So that's something that Denise, my supervisor, has found in her service at the Wallingford Senior Center with folks. So, yeah.
Hi, Lindsay, she, her. One thing I was thinking too, as you were talking, Evelyn, is the idea of meeting people where they're at and asking people what do they want. I think it's really easy sometimes from an outside perspective to say, oh, somebody is houseless, let's do that first. That's clearly the most important, right? You know, Asher, you mentioned like basically Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But sometimes people, what we think their basic needs are might not feel like the basic needs to them. And so asking people, you know, okay, there's all these different pieces of your life, right? Maybe they have mental health issues, maybe they have addiction issues, maybe there are these other pieces that for them, that's the most important thing to get stabilized first. And for them, it doesn't feel like housing. And so I think it's important to look at what do they want rather than what do we think that people need, because maybe then we can address those things with the low and high barrier of getting them to a place where they feel like they are worthy of the housing or working through some of those other pieces. And I also think too, Zach, you mentioned something about integrated care, and I think that's something that really needs to be addressed so much more thoroughly. I mean, they've shown if we can integrate care of like housing, mental health, substance use disorder, and physical health treatment in one place that's actually accessible, people get all those needs met. But our system is incredibly fractured, and there's very few places that actually can address all those needs. And so people fall through the cracks and they get frustrated and they don't know how to get there, and it can feel really complicated. And so I think it's also looking at how can we all come together and partner in these different ways so that people can access all of those things and tell us which ones they want first, so that we can have more of a low barrier for all of these different pieces for people.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment here? Okay, so I have a question. Just because clarification may be needed, what are some of the barriers? I know that you mentioned some, and I think I heard addiction. Yep. So active addiction is a barrier, or even previous history. Okay. Okay. In accessing resources. Thank you. What else?
Angela, her. I can only speak on my experience with homelessness as someone that was homeless. And I don't like the individual needs are so abundant. And I went from trauma to active drug addiction to crime to prison. And I had these stigmas of not being able to integrate myself back into society once I became a felon mainly. And then now, since I have been out of prison and work with the homeless, the diverseness in the homelessness is where I've run into almost always addiction where in our area. And a lot of times that stemmed from living outside, needing an escape. So we all know that. But it's the mental health issues. Like I was able not to, luckily, I have mental health issues, but they have been transformed into, I have a nephew that is so far gone. I don't know how that we can separate those things and assess those individuals' needs that are so much deeper. I presently live in a house where I was able to transition. I work at a place where they transition you from the street to treatment or housing. And in the house that I live in, we're able to offer life skills, things. And so it's like small stepping stones to assess those needs. And how we do it in a greater form, I have no idea, this is fantastic to hear others' views, but in my own homelessness, those were my barriers. And it became an evolving thing of once I got this, I was already a drug, or I had the trauma, the drug addiction, the felonies, and then it became something that just kept going around. I got a housing voucher. I couldn't get a house. I had housing, but I could not get someone to rent to me because I had a felony. So what I did was I went back out and committed more crimes. And this is a cycle of not just addiction, but homelessness. So that's what my barriers were.
Thank you. And I just want to, so I put judicial status. Does that kind of explain, okay, the issues of felony? Thank you. And I also added, it wasn't mentioned, but citizen status, I think is probably going to also attribute to that. Thank you. Thank you.
This is Gigi, dating pronouns. And I just want to kind of like emphasize that addiction and all these barriers are not necessarily like individual barrier to homelessness. It might be like a result from homelessness that causing people to have mental illness, have addiction and all that stuff. And if you think of it, because I also work with people that are survivor of DVSA, and you really see the interpersonal violence, how it is, how do I describe it? When people see interpersonal violence, more and more people begin to understand that when you're being abused, your entire mindset change, that you think you're worthless, you don't deserve this and that. And really it's the same idea when you experience state violence, when all of us experience state violence, but especially the poor, that you are constantly being told you're worthless, you don't deserve this and that. And then we also tell them, why don't you lift yourself up? Why don't you, we're making all this thing accessible to you, why don't you do this? But without saying that we have internalized all these message, they have internalized all these message that they don't deserve it. Yeah, this is not necessarily answering question, but what Evelyn was saying about accessibility really reminds me of that, because a lot of the client we work at, I think for people that are not actively involved in shelter, they imagine a houseless person will be so happy, enthusiastic once they have a opportunity to any housing. But a lot of time you see them run away, you see them escape, because the feeling of having something that you can lose is almost scary when you're so used to just being treated as like nothing. So there's just a lot of mental dynamic of how the society see poor people and how people internalize those messages that also cause it to be so hard. And like you were saying about people who are severely mentally ill or categorized as severely mentally ill, when we talk about affordable housing, I mean, we talk about affordable housing for a decade, for so long now. Now I'm like tired of talking about it. I feel like people should fight for free housing, because there are always people that can produce in a way that capitalism want them to produce. There is no way that they can afford rent. So yeah, and yeah, just important of free housing, and how do we move from affordable housing? How do we move from affordable housing without challenging the state to stop building for the rich?
Yeah, and so you said it. You said capitalism. I'm like, we can totally take this to a whole nother place, because what are the systems that are in existence that have already attributed to all of the iniquities that are attributing to the houselessness, right? And to mental illness, and to undiagnosed trauma, unserved trauma. But let's continue.
No, I agree with you, Gigi. And everything that's been said, everybody's really thoughtful, and I know we're all out there, and I really appreciate your sharing your story. But I wanted to say, as a social worker and also the mother of a son who's been homeless, that the fragmentation of the system is very difficult, I think, for people to access. I mean, I'm a social worker, and it is so challenging sometimes to just get these different things pulled together, so somebody can pull together their application, or, you know, they need their ID, they do the community entry for all somewhere else. They have to pick up their medication somewhere else. They may not have a bus pass. I mean, that stuff can be really daunting. And, you know, I'm someone who knows the resources, I'm able to function and get those out there, and it's still difficult for me. So I can't even imagine how hard it is for people who are just, you know, who are just barely managing. Yeah, so that to me is a really big challenge in this city. I've seen it in other cities, but I've also seen models of success in other cities. But I really see a lot of fragmentation here. So.
And when you say fragmentation, just of the support systems and accessibility to those systems and the way that they're provided?
Yes.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Sometimes providers aren't even aware of each other, what everybody's doing.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you.
My name is Isabel, and I'm new to Seattle, fairly new to Seattle. I have a background in chemical dependency counseling, and I think a sensitivity towards this particular issue of homelessness because of some of my exposure. I have a question about, is there in existence in the greater Seattle area some sort of umbrella organization that does pull these various agencies and resources together? I have never heard of anything like that. I don't know what models people are talking about when they talk about cities that have these models that we could, maybe investigate a little bit more, or maybe have investigated. I don't know. I just don't know the history of the background. So I'm questioning, it's more of an educational issue for me, that what has been done, who's taking the lead in this city on homelessness, as opposed to who's taking the lead on housing, or who's taking the lead on feeding the homeless. The only model city that I know anything about is Boston, that began with the organization called Healthcare for the Homeless. And they have become the foremost leader in the country, not only taking care of people's physical health by going out on the streets to the homeless, and by involving the many good hospitals that are there and taking care, involving the politicians that are there, involving the sports teams that are there, getting that sort of capitalistic kind of support, if you want to call it, instead of us trying to, build this from the ground up. What has been done? Who needs to be engaged still? Who is the power around here to make that happen? And it in Boston, I know it took 35 to happen. It took a long time. I don't think we have 35 years in Seattle. So if anybody has the answer to that.
Yeah, and one of kind of what is resonating with me with what you said is I heard community. I actually heard baseball teams and these folks and politicians and all that, but I also heard like a community that was coming together to sort of support this initiative, not just a bunch of individual organizations and people. So does anybody have any? Yeah.
I always go back to resources. So we do have enough resources in this city, they're just not allocated appropriately. There's a lot of concentration of wealth in few hands and great amount of need for many others. I agree there's fragmentation, but in the environment of scarcity that we operate in, it's not really fair to view the systems as the fault when there's really nowhere for anyone to go. So some of what you see when you're doing outreach, people become hopeless because there's nowhere for them to go. So there's an amount of being rejected, but it's also you're never given an option because there's just not enough for everybody. So we in this country have decided, with some of our very scarce housing dollars, we're going to require people to do something called coordinated entry, which is a very wonky policy thing. But basically what coordinated entry does is it requires you to spend your housing dollars on a system to assess everybody who's experiencing homelessness in order to funnel them to very few housing units. So basically what coordinated entry ended up doing was assessing all these people, putting them on a list, and there's nowhere for anyone to go. So we immediately opened up coordinated entry, 11,000 people on a list, The list is staying at that number. So then people are suffering and not surviving. And in that environment, it is extremely fragmented and it's not fair, it's not just, and it's not working. So what we need to do is change the way resources are allocated.
I think the short answer to the question, as we've covered, is like kind of a no on that. But I know that for at least for services for seniors, Sound Generations is kind of an umbrella organization and offers services, but all kinds of services, and communicates and coordinates that to the best that they can within, you know, the mess that everything else kind of is. Yeah, I also just wanted to agree with the note that coordinated entry is, some of the people that I interviewed were on wait lists for years and had severe medical consequences of that. And yeah, there's no way to move it forward. There are some intense racial disparities in that system as well, and how we and how trauma works in that assessment. Yeah.
I have a clarifying question. You said there's no way to move it forward.
There's not enough housing to move the wait list forward. Yeah, so that's where the need for housing comes back in, whether it's, you know, free or you know, things that people are pushing for now more, but like someone like, and also the because there's so little housing available to put people in, during the assessment, the bar is set in a place where, for example, if you have a car to sleep in, you are considered, you know, not having need. Like you're like not homeless enough to receive any sort of priority on that list. So yeah, that's how it doesn't move forward.
Are y'all familiar with the Seattle process? You heard that? Kind of sounds like that.
Kalan, she, her, or they, them, the others, fine. Not familiar with Seattle process. I feel like I'm getting more of a sense of it right now, like in my gut. And I don't know if anybody else is feeling a little overwhelmed. There was a moment I just felt a drop happen. And I need to acknowledge that because I think it happens and I start to kind of tune out because it feels so big. And I got to remember, like, and so little bit of a tangent, but not much. I just want to throw out Immersion Strategies because there, you can just check out the book. You can look it up online. But I love what's happening here in terms of collaboration and like what I'm hearing. First of all, I'm really grateful I'm learning a lot. I've been here a few years, but I started grad school like a year after I got here, and I don't know a lot about what's actually in place, for better or worse. So I'm learning a lot, and I'm more of a big picture person. So it's good to know. It's good to know what's happening. It's also hard to know what's happening. But Emergent Strategies is really all about collaboration and that organic process and what happens when we all have our piece and we come together. Even the pieces that our first reaction might be like, ooh, like there's value somewhere in the conversation and keeping that going. And it's so important. And I'm hearing a lot of pieces, like we've all got these pieces that are our pieces to hold down. And so I hold on to that when I'm feeling overwhelmed. It's like, what's my piece? I'm going to do the best I can with my piece. And so I just wanted to say that into the room, and that's enough, like knowing that that's enough and collaborating with others who are holding down their pieces and having conversations like this. I mean, I've got some ideas jamming around just from some things that people have said that I think are really juicy and important, and certainly while they feel hard, also give me a little bit of hope. And then just to mention, I think the other thing besides like big picture systemic stuff is I'm hearing the importance of each, I mean, we're talking about a demographic, but everybody's like their own universe of how they got where they are and what they need, and that's so important. And like, I'm working with some folks right now. I'm putting together a list of things for like, what do people need when they do maybe get housing? Now what? Because there are some people, and it's been said in a couple ways, that, and I was one of those people. I really appreciate you sharing. I've been homeless twice in my life, and very different experiences. Once as a teenager when I was trafficked, and then as an older adult with a disability that couldn't afford to pay rent, but had some years of therapy and resources. It was different. I didn't have, it was still, man, I battled with the stigma, but it was just different. I had done enough work and enough healing and enough work on the trauma that I knew sort of what to do to, but I didn't have that when I was younger. And when I was placed somewhere or had housing, I blew it up. I didn't know how to, it came with a whole nother set of problems that I wasn't equipped to handle. And then people were like, what the fuck are you doing? And there was more shame and confusion. So, and that's kind of what I heard you saying earlier, Gloria, about like, like looking at what's happening with someone and what's the best entry point for that particular person. So, and then a couple of, at some point we're going to talk about resources, right? Like, is that happening? Or I don't know, there were some questions about comprehensive stuff I think is so important, and it's so rare. But there are a few places doing it. I don't know how well they're doing it compared to, but I see some good efforts happening. Like I work for Therapeutic Health Services, and with 9 branches, some of them offer primary care on the premises, case management, groups, therapy, chemical dependency, work, that kind of stuff. And LEAP is another program I recently have been hearing about that supposedly does like whatever you need, we will work with you to get you, whatever your constellation of needs are to get you housed, and then what do you need to make that work for you. So I'm going to stop now, but thank you.
Thank you. So I added Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown to the list of resources. One of the things that I actually really love about that book is this idea that we have to try to put ourselves in a place in which we can imagine an existence that doesn't exist, that's never existed, in order to find solutions for the problems that we have now. I don't know that we're ready to necessarily shift. There may be some unanswered questions in the room, but I think that ultimately, shortly, we'll move into a place of solution. But we'll hold off on that for a moment. I'm going to hold space for any other questions. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Will, and I come to this. You talked about fragmentation. I heard that a number of times, only from a part of this, and that's the behavioral health part of it. I don't know that much about the other issues that impact homelessness, but I know that there's lots of them. I know people are dealing with criminal justice system and disability and all of that. So one thing that I see in the behavioral health system, and you have resources that come down through block grant funds, and that you've got behavioral health organizations, and you've got providers that are supposed to be working through it, is that system as a whole is very fragmented. And it's so much a part of what people are dealing with when they're in homeless situations and when they need to access these services, that people tend to access these services only when there's a crisis, and keeping the relationships with people, especially people who don't have an address that you can't keep in touch with, and making sure that medication management is happening and that counseling and follow-up is happening, and all of that is really, really difficult. And one challenge that I see is that this process is getting more fragmented because of changes at the state level. So what used to be your king BHO, Behavioral Health Organization, now we have managed care organizations getting involved with it. Now we're driving the public systems to really only crisis response. We're hoping that sort of the insurance companies will be able to, take care of this Medicaid population. I just don't see that they have an incentive to really do that. I see they have an incentive to make sure that they don't use services, or that they only, they're only providing those services that are absolutely necessary, because they've got a margin involved, and I think that's really a problem. So, for what it's worth.
Just to tie a few things together, I guess, and maybe go back to your question from earlier. But I think that part of the reason why there's no big wraparound system with just one group is because we're all fighting over the same resources. We're operating from the space of scarcity, right? So either we're fighting for government dollars or we're fighting for privately funded dollars. And so we're all reaching out to the same people over and over and over again, asking the same people to give us money for the same population of people, and they feel like nothing's getting done with their money, so they're done giving it to us, right? So we start coming up with all these different housing solutions. Being new to Seattle, you might not have seen some of them. We don't just have like the standard shelters, but we also have like tent cities that are semi-sanctioned, and we also have tiny house villages, and there's a group called the Block Project, I believe, and they create tiny houses in the backyards of folks who own their homes, and let them host people to live on their property and be in their neighborhood and be a part of their neighborhood, which I think helps us access that human piece that we're missing in a lot of the bureaucracy of pushing our papers and pushing the people from desk to desk to desk. Yeah. And I think that kind of pluralism is really nice when we have all these different people who like maybe would want to live in a tiny house that has like an overhang on the outside, because sometimes they don't feel comfortable sleeping inside where they're confined, or maybe they need the space to be able to go outside and walk around, but gates closed or shelters closed, you can't leave. Or if something happens and you slip up and you do some stuff you're not supposed to do, now you're out of your housing for tonight or maybe an extended period of time. I think that because we have so many different problems, we have so many different solutions, and now we have even more people fighting for the same money, and we have more people trying to pose that their solution is the best solution, and that's okay. That each solution is going to be best for different people. But I think that the reason why we don't have that big wraparound system is because we don't have any way to coordinate it, and we don't have the money to fund it. And there's no way that all these different groups are going to end up one big group without a really big fight.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Shannon, she, her pronouns. And if you guys already covered this, someone can just like cut me off, but I'm wondering if, like how, let's talk about the stigma of homelessness, how we talk about it better with people, and come up with some good, for better or worse, talking points. I am a grad student, but I'm also have worked in small business, like owning and operating small businesses, and I'm currently working in Georgetown for a small business. And just the conversations that come up with the business owners who are, I believe, like well-intentioned people, but just a kind of like a lack of knowledge, and they just say harmful things sometimes, and then the residents who live there. And so I would just like to figure out, how we can, engage communities better, come up with some like really good talking points, because this is hard, and people don't know. I don't think that I've had, I've kind of called people out saying, hey, like, that's not true. And they'll be like, oh, really? And they don't know. Yeah, and then I just want to say, and if anyone in the room has the answer to this, I'd be curious, wondering in the city of Seattle, if the city considers people in shelters as housed. Okay. Okay, good.
Shuja, they, them, he, him. Actually, I did hear Zach say something about race, but it's like really just weird to me that we have gender and citizen status and judicial status, but nothing about race and race biases for people that are looking for services, and how that can contribute to these barriers being high or low.
You're holding the mic. Okay, let me turn around. There you are.
Lindsay, she, her. I think what I'm hearing you talk about too is kind of the individual basis, right? Like we've spent a lot of time tonight kind of talking about that upper level, state services, coordination, integration, all those pieces, which is really, really important. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think that is going to be the way that we can really attack this problem, but also on the individual level, right? Like it is important to also learn how to offer education to other people because people don't know. And what I often see is that people react to homeless people with fear, right? They're unhoused and there's this fear of if I am like them, I might end up there too, right? And so I think people create this artificial distance between themselves and unhoused people. And so I think a big part of it is like get to know the people who are unhoused in your neighborhood and invite other people to get to know them too. I've made it a practice for many years to go out and meet them and learn their names and hear their stories and talk to them, you know, greet them when I see them, remember their names and do those pieces. And so I think that's one thing we can each do, even just on an individual level, to let these people know that they are human beings. They are seen. We do care about them, right? We might not be able to offer them a home right then and there, but even that interpersonal connection, I think, can offer a healing on more of that emotional and psychological level. I'm fortunate to be part of a movement called Awaken the Lion, along with Suja and Evelyn here. And we're going to be offering more of that individual companionship and just getting to know people and going out and just offering them time and being with other people as people. And so I think that that is a really important thing to bring into this conversation as well. So thank you for bringing up that piece. And then, you know, finding that education, learning about the numbers and little statistics and things like that. There's a lot of organizations that have those, and then sharing those with people as we can, broaching those conversations, calling people out, like you said. It can be a really uncomfortable thing, but I think it's all of our responsibilities as we're doing this work to call those things out on whatever spectrum they come up and let people know it's not true and do what we can.
Thank you. This is Gigi, data and pronounce. I will say it's always important to challenge people, like challenge us as a society. Why do we fear? Like, why are we more upset at seeing poverty than poverty itself? And yeah, and it always have to bring back to how people don't see how the system oppression work. People see like homelessness as an individual fault instead of state violence, like I said earlier. And yeah, and that result in people consuming a lot of poverty porn, which means you see poor people and you're like, well, I should be so grateful. And that's it. That's how the work, that's the end of their analysis. They go volunteer at a shelter, which is great, but it stopped there, just seeing how, oh, they're suffering so much. I should be more grateful, and that's it. So we're never lack of people that want to do charity work, but we lack the people who want to build, like tear up the system that cause charity need to be a fair in the first place. So really envisioning, like talk to your people around you, talk to your family, and envision a society that poverty doesn't have to be a necessarily thing. Poverty doesn't have to be a thing that is, yeah. And like I grew up not in a different country, and homelessness is not. I don't see people on the street growing up. Before people in Seattle, that is the common thing. People are so used to it, and that itself is a problem. Yeah.
This is Zach again, and I'll take a break because I've been talking a lot after this. But I just wanted to say that there have been some conversations on small scales that have been had recently that I've been a part of, talking about the need for more organized messaging about this issue, because I was talking with some of the other panelists before we started about an event that happened last month at UW that seemed to have some pretty big money backing it and was pushing a specific narrative that I think is dishonest and misleading and ultimately kind of dangerous. So it kind of boils back down to creating like an umbrella group to have sort of more standardized maybe that's not the right word, but like really boiled down, easy, go-to myth-busting points with like that are, that get at, trauma and like the underlying roots of things for people to understand, because there are some entities that ultimately, it really kind of seemed were coming from federal level interests that were backing this panel that I attended. So the momentum on that thing that I've been a part of is kind of puttering along. But I think that that is a really important thing for us to do, because if we're all kind of doing our own thing, we may or may not be losing right now on that messaging. Yeah, I know that the Third Door Coalition has some really good infographics on this kind of stuff. If anybody listening out there wants to check it out, or anyone else here wants to speak to that, or something like that, but that's my 2 cents on that.
Thank you. So I want to make sure that we get that resource, hopefully. So, and all of y'all who have kind of thrown some things out there, it's hard to go in between the two to write the resources and notes, but please remember that you just let me know. And one thing I do want to say is that it's really important to have information, absolutely. And then I also want to acknowledge that a lot of folks feel overwhelmed in general. And I want to say that one almost kind of simple thing that many folks I think can access in a point when you don't have the information is ask a question. You can seriously just ask a question. What is it that you see that makes you think that? And you may or may not get a great answer, but you may trigger them into thinking more about, why am I thinking this? Or where am I getting this from? And that can be a good thing to have in the tool bag. Anybody else? Yeah.
I have a question Jenna, she, her pronouns. And I have a question about solution-based thinking. One thing that from the last panel I felt was both a big issue, and I didn't feel like I heard a lot of compelling evidence that we as a society have like a steadfast solution, is addiction. And we were talking before about Gabor Mate's book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, and he said, instead of asking why the addiction, we should say why the pain, why the trauma. And I'm curious from all of your perspectives, what works?
Hi, Lindsay again. I can answer this from a personal standpoint and a professional standpoint. So I'll have 10 years clean myself in November. Thank you. So, for me, it was treatment and getting hooked in with the 12-step community and getting a community of other people like me who understood me from that lived experience in a way that other people can't and don't. And so I think a lot of times it is that community, right? Because addiction isolates us and makes us think we're the only one. And it is very stigmatizing. It is very shameful. And so finding that community of other people who can relate and who understand you and can support you, I know for me and for a lot of other people that I've worked with, that has really truly been the thing, is that connection, finding that spirituality, something outside of ourselves and greater than, that can help us to heal and learn to live a different way of life, is really important. And then from a professional standpoint, I've worked both in abstinence-based treatment, and now I'm working in harm reduction, methadone, Suboxone, as well as abstinence-based treatment that offers that truly integrated wraparound care. It's incredible. And, I think it is, again, it's meeting people where they're at. There is not a one size fits all. For me, 12 steps, NA has been phenomenal and truly life-saving. That is not going to fit for everybody. And so I think it's educating ourselves and others about the different resources. For some people, it's treatment. For some people, it's 12-step. We're pretty lucky here in Seattle. There's a lot of different programs. We've got Smart Recovery, we've got Life Ring, we've got Buddhist Recovery, we've got Refuge Recovery. So there's a lot of community and peer-led places as well. And then there's all different types of treatments. And so there's a lot out there, but again, I don't think a lot of it is, fortunately, it's not very coordinated, and not a lot of places offer that integrated care. But again, I think the answer is typically asking people, what do they want? What do they need? And meeting them where they're at, and that might change over time.
And yeah, I definitely understand and agree with you. But also, I personally think that people need to know that a person has to want the help, and they need to know the hard work that's going to be behind it. In being a recovery coach, usually the question you ask them is how, what are your goals? How can I help you? And if you have anything like a carrot in front of them to get them to be in a program or to go to treatment or whatever, they're going to play a game on you, because they're like saying, what you got? And some of them go through those programs and they're not ready. They relapse because they're not ready. So I think it's important for us to realize, and yes, you do have to meet people where they are, and people are going to come back many times for help. But I just feel, no, you can't stop trying to help them. But you also have to know they have to want to do it.
Thank you. And I think, just one moment, and correct me if I'm wrong. So it exists within a model of meeting folks where they are, that understanding that they may not be ready, but also that they are still human and have those needs that need to be met, and allowing those needs to be met in that case. Did you have anything else with that?
I would just add that I think sometimes it can be problematic if we view that people have to be ready, because people can come in not ready, but that is that part of meeting them where they're at. Because I think that there's for a long time been this belief that people have to hit bottom before they can get better. But if we allow people to hit bottom, they can die, and they do a lot. And so I think it's really important to look at where can we raise that bottom. And that's where I think a lot of the harm reduction models come in, or offering other services. But, sometimes people aren't necessarily ready, but that's where, professionally we learn how to help people find out where they are motivated and build on that, and really work with them from that perspective, rather than saying they have to be ready. Because I've seen a lot of people who they come in and they're there because they are court ordered to be there, or they're there because their family wants them to be there, or they're there for all of these outside things. External motivation could get someone in the door so that we can build that internal motivation. People don't necessarily come in with the internal motivation. And so I think it's important to really look at where can we help people find what that is, because sometimes I think it comes back to what Evelyn was talking about with the self-worth as well, and the stigma. People don't necessarily believe they're worth it, or they don't think that they can do it, and so they don't want to try, because that failing, as they often see it, I'll say we often see it, then there's something to lose. So I think it's that same piece again as well.
Thank you. Sorry, really quick, because I just had you. So is this in the same string of addiction? Okay, all right. So I'm going to go here and then there. All right, thank you.
So, Angela, my experience with my 30-year addiction, I now have 2 years in recovery, but what changed me, thank you, how I was able to, and I can't stress it enough, that all of the programs out there are phenomenal. But where I had to start was my cognitive thinking process. I didn't realize that it was how I thought, because of where I came from and what I'd been through, that made me reach for something that created something that I believed I needed, but it was the cognitive thing. And I have seen great success in my fellow people that I'm surround myself in or with, people that are have been through the cognitive behavioral therapy or thinking process. I have taken post-traumatic stress, cognitive processing, as well as the behavioral part. And it was, I mean, for someone that was in addiction for 30 years and pretty much threw my hands up, there was no bottom. There was no bottom. I'd OD'd 4 times. I didn't see until somebody put it in my face. It's not what's wrong with you. It's what's you're thinking about yourself. So as you saying, is there a solution? I integrate in every conversation I have with people every day when they say, how did you do it? My thinking. I had to change my thinking. So I try to integrate how I think about them and show them there's a better way to think. Like, you know, you can, the half glass full, half empty, whatever, that type of thing. So I'm just really passionate about that because it changed my life and pulled me out of the hole. And thank goodness we have all these programs that you don't have to just go to NA or CA or even SMART, you know, I forget what it's called, but I know people that are in it, and it starts with our cognitive thinking.
I'm Isabel. I have a question for Lindsay, I think, or for anyone else who wants to comment, but we're talking about a population in the city that doesn't have any housing, no jobs, no medical care, no mental health care. What is the status of treatment centers here that would be willing to accept people from that particular population? I have no idea, but I know treatment is very expensive. So is the treatment availability up to the task of taking care of people who are this marginalized?
This field is chronically understaffed and underfunded. Absolutely. And, you know, a lot of treatment centers, they do go for the private pay insurance because that is where the money is. And it is really unfortunate. And honestly, it disgusts me that there are for-profit businesses providing this type of care. I don't think insurance or healthcare should be monetized at all. That's another fight. There are treatment agencies that will take people in the population. I am fortunate enough to work for one of them. I haven't named it because I'm not here representing them, and that isn't my place to, but there are some, right? And so a lot of times it is about helping people access getting on state insurance. Thank God that's easier than it used to be, in order for people to then access that care. And so there are funds, there are treatment agencies, there are places, but there's not enough of them, not even close to it. And it is hard to access, and there's, you know, still red tape and hoops to jump through and things. So the system needs a complete and total overhaul, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Margaret, again, just a quick follow up on that, which is that I've worked in a lot of situations where the person has both physical and mental challenges. And so for folks who might need assistance with their activities of daily living or other types of medication or treatment for some of their chronic illnesses along with the treatment, it's even more difficult to find a place where all those needs can be met in one place. So.
I see a colleague from DESC over here. Where do you work in supportive housing or outreach or Medicaid or? Cool. Great. Glad you're here. I believe housing is part of the continuum of treatment, and some of the housing that we provide at DESC in Plymouth is the lowest barrier housing that I'm aware of in Seattle. So we are striving to serve the most vulnerable people with no barriers. We only have barriers that the government's funding our programs require, so that we're not looking at what you've done in your past. We're not judging you by the worst thing you've ever done. And I think that's one of the things that I say often when I'm out talking to groups of people is that we at Plymouth, and I think what we should ask ourselves of our community, is that we're not judging people by the worst thing they ever did, or the worst situation they're in. It's not we should strive for better than that. But we practice harm reduction at Plymouth. I know DESC is a strong practitioner of harm reduction. I believe there have to be more spaces where that is incorporated into what the program is. So you're lowering your barriers, you're bringing folks in right away. There may be situations where, like you say, they don't want to be inside in a small apartment for some period of time. We have folks who will move in after being outside for decades, and they won't sleep in their apartment for weeks, or they'll sleep in a tent on the floor. They'll sleep in a sleeping bag on the floor, and it will take time. But I will say from the experience and what I've learned from people who've come before me, people who work at DESC, people who work at Evergreen Treatment Services, people who've worked at Plymouth for decades, the outcomes that supportive housing has, low barrier, housing the most vulnerable people that society is not serving well, the outcomes are really incredible. And it is our duty to not ask them for anything. We are coming to them with housing. There is paperwork for sure. There's a lot of bureaucracy. I wish we need to fix a lot of that. But people will stay housed for a long period of time that I think many folks would be surprised by. So it's in the housing and homelessness community. We try to work together a lot. There's a lot of work to be done I'm always talking about more resources, but there's also laws we need to change. We have to, and a lot of that gets at systemic racism. Thank you for bringing that up. We have intentional policies in this country that have segregated communities and taken away wealth from people of color, primarily people who are African American. And it is now our job to undo that intentionally with policies to change that. So changing our zoning, changing our housing policies and investments, and it's a lot of work, but we have hope in the small steps that we take every day, I think. And I think I am living in the big picture overwhelm a lot, but there's so many amazing stories that happen at Plymouth. I'll speak about what we see every single day in one apartment. And that keeps you going. It's amazing the lives that people are living.
Angela again. I work for Pioneer Human Services, and I work in a place called the Diversion Center. I don't know that you have that, because they are from they started in the greater Seattle area and moved their way to Snohomish County. But I have seen such a success rate within the last year. And what they do is they have social workers working with, and it's a lot of work. There's only 42 beds, and they're not always full. But there is a lot of the social workers go out and they find these homeless people. They've gone into the camps, and then they bring them into the diversion center where we house them for a short period of time where we can get them on Suboxone or mental health or assess their needs appropriately. And then that social worker, targets them for what their particular needs are. And it has been a great, and then when they go to say treatment, if that's which has been the basic need for most of them, they go to treatment, they come back to us, and then they are given a housing voucher for a certain amount of time. They're given clothing, they're given toiletries, bus passes, and then but they have to stay in their outpatient treatment if that's what their target was, or if they go to housing in their mental health situation is different, and it just is assessed, and it has been only open for a year, and it's been a great success so far. I am with a lot of people in the program and other people that have come off the streets and their lives have changed. At the Hoff Foundation, we work closely with them and integrate them into the housing. For right now, we just have women-based houses, and we're working on a men, structure. But that has been, as a solution, believe it or not, has been in our county. Sorry, I'm not up with the King County resources and stuff. It would be so overwhelming, but that has been something that's worked. And I have asked my boss, do they have it in King County? He said, I just don't think so, and he said, but I thought, you guys are so much more, advanced, advanced and stuff. So that's just something that has really worked or is starting to work in our area. But it's only 42 beds and the need is much more.
I have a quick question for Kelly. Are we in the big picture projecting to fill the gaps in all the housing needs that you were stating stats on in the beginning? Is, like a citywide, I don't know, Plymouth and all the others, or?
No. But that's why we're here. We need to keep going. The National Low Income Housing Coalition does a gap report across the country. And Washington State ranks 47th in the country in providing enough homes for people who are experiencing income levels. So we provide, I can't remember the number, one for every one person, for every, it's bad. It's very bad. It's a West Coast crisis, which, a lot of folks are aware of. But other localities have made significant investments. So you've seen huge housing bonds pass in California. You saw a major zoning change passed in Minneapolis to eliminate single family zoning. There's been a lot of work in Oregon. We're doing a lot of work in Washington, but we really need something like a major investment. And so in the housing community, we're talking more now about housing is infrastructure. In our community, for decades, the number one issue for voters that was polled was transportation. What happens when voters say that transportation is the number one issue is we get Sound Transit 1, Sound Transit 2, and Sound Transit 3. Sound Transit 3 is $53 billion. Pairing the infrastructure of housing and the affordable housing crisis and need with the transit infrastructure, I think, is a wise strategy. And locating housing along transportation corridors that makes sense for communities, bringing opportunity into communities, not offering opportunity for people to leave communities, keeping communities where they are, keeping culture where it needs to be, and bringing the opportunity to those folks where they want it. But we need something on the scale of Sound Transit for housing. And the resources are here. We have them. We just need to rearrange them. So that's what we need to do.
I just had a follow-up question and that being like, what exactly do you mean when you say rearrange them? Are we talking like bureaucratically or revenue-wise?
This is on the radio, isn't it? I strongly believe that government should work for the people. I believe in government institutions, and I believe that the best way for them to operate is to funnel the resources appropriately through democratic institutions. We have a very upside-down tax structure in the state. It's very clear. There have been several efforts made in the vein of progressive taxation. So I believe we need to move toward more progressive taxation.
Some Shuja, they, them, he, him, like things that stand out to you that is making the West Coast have a houselessness crisis more than any other places?
I don't know why that is, except for that the infrastructure has simply not kept up with the population change. I think there's a global phenomenon of urbanization, and urban centers are not keeping up. From what I learned from talking to a lot of colleagues around the country, no one has solved the gentrification problem. No one has solved problem of displacement. No one has solved our problem of segregation. We're working on it right now. I think there's a lot of progressive policy that has been done in Seattle. We are not We have not won. We're not done by any means. There's a lot of work to be done. But there has been incredible prosperity on the West Coast with the tech boom. And there's a lot of data to show that when rents increase, this starts to get very big market, and I'm not an economist, but I've heard some economists present on this. You have a massive amount of wealth move into an area, the rents will increase because the demand is there. There's a very strong correlation between a rent increase and a homelessness increase. So this has been shown in multiple communities across the country that it's like a strong correlation. People will fight that it's causality, but we certainly believe in our community that the rent increases and these market forces are having massive impacts on people who are struggling at the lowest income levels. So progressive taxation would help.
We are close to time. Does anybody else have anything else? Yeah.
So how do we continue to get all these good stories out there? Social media, you don't hear the good stories all the time about homelessness and what people are doing about it. So how do we continue, how do we keep that in the forefront? I mean,
I would argue that this is part of it. Showing up here, I think that's part of it. I don't know if anyone else has something to add, but continuing to have those conversations in the groups that you're in.
It was brought up earlier to have campaigns to talk about these kinds of things. Yeah. Remember there was I don't know if you guys take the bus, but on the bus for a while, there was a campaign called Let's Face It, right? And it was pictures of houseless people. And it was just like, hey, like, look at them, like look at them. That was the whole campaign. Having more campaigns like that, I think would be so helpful. I know that when I started school, I was like all on this, like, I'm going to do all these campaigns and I want everybody to talk to people who are out on the street. I need them to understand that they're not crazy and they're not scary, and you don't need to like walk past them super fast and maybe they'll grab you if you don't, because that's how people treat them. So maybe, yeah, like this is a good conversation. Conversations online are good conversations, but then people become those like, Twitter finger situations, like having in-face conversations, talking to people. That is the biggest way that you can close that distance between people, is just to literally talk. This is perfect. We need everyone to do this every week.
Thank you, Evelyn. Yeah.
And really, what I try to think about is it's not us and them, it's we. And we're all part of this. Those who have and those who don't, we're all part of it. And that's why, I always try to talk to people and just get to know them. And maybe there's things they assume about me, and there might be things I assume about them. But I think it's really important to keep your eyes open, treat everybody as you want to be treated, which is a very basic thing. But basically, it's a we issue. And I think it's become an othering issue in this place. And it's collectively, it's all of us together. So.
I just learned about an organization yesterday called Project on Family Homelessness out of Seattle University. And I need to do a little bit more research and find out more about what they do. But I know that the overall goal is to do storytelling. And I was unaware of this group when I was doing my research, which was about storytelling. But I chatted with someone in their, I think, leadership yesterday, and it sounds pretty cool. So that's just another resource to throw out there.
They have an event tomorrow at 11:30. Awesome.
name of the organization?
The organization name is Project on Family Homelessness, and they have an event tomorrow at 11:30 at Seattle U. Awesome.
Evelyn. Yeah.
Photo projects. That just came to my mind. Photo projects. Something that I remember is the gentleman who is the architect behind the Block project also takes photographs of people. And then there are other campaigns out there where people are taking pictures and putting stories underneath it. I know that when I was going to SPU, the whole reason why we were interviewing people at Tent City 3 was so that we could get their stories out there. And that was the whole point. That was what all our research was. So sorry, I just like full forgot that, but like photo projects.
Yeah, and there's a lot of other organizations that are actually coordinating story and community together, which I will list on here. And then I think we can post those via the Facebook page at a later date. Bless you. Anything else? Okay. So there's a lot we didn't get to. There's a lot we can't get to in a short amount of time. But I want to take a moment to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank all of you for showing up, for the conversation that we did have. We're going to close shortly, but I invite you to hang out and continue conversations amongst you, continue conversations with your community, because those are the places in which it can be most impactful. It may not feel like having a conversation with your neighbor on this topic is a big deal, but every little bit is a movement towards better understanding and compassion. So I'll invite us again to find our feet, find our seat, and maybe begin by finding a way to sit up just a little bit taller. Lift your heart, take a nice deep breath in, shrug your shoulders up towards your ears, and exhale out of the mouth and let it go. Really good. Once more, inhale, shrug your shoulders up. Exhale, let it go. Once more, big inhale, and the biggest sigh ever. Really good, beautiful. And take these next few moments for yourself, grounding into your presence. And thank you.